Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan says Turkey has so far allocated $35 billion for all the refugees in Turkey. Now, this includes an astonishingly big number of Syrian refugees to the tune of 4 million. Now, arguably, Turkey hosts the most number of refugees, including those that are from Syria. By one account, by the UNHCR, 3.7 Syrian refugees are living in Turkey. Now, this is a number highest in the entire world in terms of countries hosting refugees. And according to reports from the UNHCR, Turkey has already spent over $8 billion on refugees there. Now, alongside this important statement that came from the president of Turkey, what he's also said is he's defended his goal of setting up a 32-kilometer deep safe zone in the war-torn country along the border with Turkey. He said besides it being a necessity for the safe repatriation of Syrian refugees, Turkey's aim will stay strong to protect Turkey from terrorists. And he's referring to the US-backed Syrian Kurdish militants that control areas in East Syria along the Turkish border. Now, what does this mean in terms of the regional politics affecting the situation in Syria, especially those displaced within Syria and also the millions residing in neighboring countries? For that, I'd like to welcome our guests. Let me first introduce Mr. Yunus Soner. He was joined us from Istanbul. He's a politician and he's also the Deputy Chairman of the International Relations Bureau based in Istanbul. And also with us, we have Mr. Yakzan Shishakly. He's the co-founder of Amaram Foundation and the director of Olive Tree Camp in the largest refugee camp in Syria. Welcome to the show. First of all, let me start with you, Mr. Yunus. As we are seeing different political developments take place, especially with the president of Turkey coming out with this statement, $35 billion allocated so far for the refugees in Turkey. Is there something that you would like to highlight here? How much of this is turning into the tune of not just humanitarian aid, but also in terms of jobs, health, and employment for these refugees?
There is a very logical point in the declaration of Mr. Erdogan, of the President Erdogan, which is in the return of the Syrian population from Turkey to Syria, back to their country, and especially to those territories they were expelled from by the, as you mentioned, US-backed so-called Kurdish militia, the PKK and the PYD. So ensuring this return of the refugees and their resettlement in their homeland is a very important and logical point. And the second point is clearing the security threats in that region, especially in the east of the Euphrates, from any armed group threats against Turkey, as well as threats against the Syrian central government. So these both points are very logical and very positive. But they leave open some questions, some serious questions as well.
And let me bring you into this conversation. If we are still to talk about the refugees and their status in Turkey, Turkey still is the only country in the world who's hosting the largest number of refugees. And out of this, 3.7 million by some accounts and 4 million, President Erdogan's own statement, are Syrian refugees. Could you tell us a little about their plight and where they are mostly situated? Are they mostly in refugee camps in Turkey, bordering Syria, or are we seeing a significant number in cities also?
Well, both of them. There is some numbers in the border regions close to Syria, but there's a huge Syrian population now, especially in the bigger cities, like in Istanbul, in Izmir, in Bursa. We have also significant numbers. These people are already integrating themselves as far as they can into the local population, into the local economy. They're looking for jobs. They are developing a certain life, daily life. They're maintaining their living on their own purposes and on their own means. So they are also part of our bigger cities as well now.
And Mr. Yazkan, if you could, Mr. Yakzan, if you could comment a little about, especially with your experience in one of the biggest IDP camps in Syria, of this announcement of a safe zone, with Erdogan constantly pushing for it, irrespective of whether he has the assistance of the US or the backing of the US or the cooperation. How do you see the development of this safe zone in terms of how this will help the repatriation of these Syrian refugees?
Of course, the safe zone is so important for refugees, for IDPs, for Syria in general. I can't talk on behalf of if the plan backed up from the United States or the Russian, but I talk as a refugee community. They're really welcoming any way to go back to the Syria, to have a little more normal life. Of course, Turkey was very generous to host, as you mentioned, over 3.5 million refugees, Syrian refugees. In the end, I mean, everybody want to go back to their home, right? So we're looking to have a safe zone where we can accomplish, where we can work again and rebuild Syria.
There's also a little, Mr. Yakzan, if you could expand more on the refugees that are displaced, the IDPs displaced within Syria itself, to the tune of, is it 5 million, I believe? And whereabouts are they mostly located? What kind of facilities are available for them? And also, what is the world doing in terms of like EU coming together with the UN and working and providing a more relief to them?
We're talking about the war where it took over 8 years. So IDPs are everywhere in Syria, of course, mostly closer to the Turkish border. We're talking only in the camps. I'm not managing the camp anymore, but only in the camps in northern Syria, we have over 500,000 IDPs, in the camps itself. So IDPs is not only in the camps, also IDPs outside the camps in every city. Even when you go to the capital, Damascus, in the street, you see IDPs move from different area to area. And then we're talking about IDPs who move more than once because of the flood happening recently, because of the war, because of shelling, and because of the changing of the political situation from area to area. So there's a big movement of IDPs, and until today, no status of being held in one place.
Okay, but
of course
sorry.
Of course, the UN and the European Union, they're working hard to help the IDPs inside Syria, but we're talking about the crisis it's been for 8 years, the number is huge, the money is getting less, and there's no way to end this situation without peace talk.
Without peace talks, you mentioned. And if I were to ask you, Mr. Yunus, how are you seeing this development, especially as earlier in January, we saw the US and Turkey coming to loggerheads about the very issue that is whether the US allies in Syria, the Kurdish forces, as seen as terrorists by Istanbul, we saw such animosity evolving from there. Do you believe that they are resolving this issue more concretely, that maybe this safe zone will serve just that purpose, or is this like a pretext to something else that we're not reading clearly?
It is a pretext. Actually, the safe zone, as I mentioned, leaves some question marks as well. And it is a pretext, it's a pre-step to something bigger, which is the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Turkey and Syria. Now, in these days, in Turkey, widely discussed is the so-called Adana Agreement. The Adana Agreement, briefly, was an agreement between Ankara and Damascus from 1998 for a joint fight against terror organizations, especially the PKK. And this agreement was practiced until the beginning of the Syrian crisis successfully, and it served well Turkey's security interests. And today, these days, this agreement has been brought into the debate by us here in Turkey, and it was retaken by the president of Russia, Mr. Vladimir Putin, as well. And the Syrian government also somewhat critically and demanding, but positively responded to the mentioning of this agreement. So the next step we will see is moving closer to the re-establishing of diplomatic relations between Syria and Turkey. And this is the main solution. This is the basic step to be taken to solve both the refugee crisis as well as the threats against Turkey. And I might mention as well that it was confirmed to us by all of them, the Iranian, the Syrian, and the Russian government, as well as Turkish authorities, that meetings between Turkish and Syrian officials at low level already take place in Tehran. 6 times in the last months, they united in Tehran, in the capital of Iran. And recently, returning from Moscow, the president of Turkey, Erdogan, declared that he would not accept a high-level meeting with the Syrian government, including that low-level meeting would be possible. So this is a pretext, and this is the final solution. A safe zone is just an intermediary step towards that, and this is what's going to come.
So intermediary step, and it is also leading to a bigger debate on the intentions of all the regional players here. But let me come back to you on the refugee crisis a little more. As Syria, Yemen, all of these areas seeing a terrible conflict, seeing a civil war within their borders, is seeing also the largest humanitarian crisis in the past few decades. So, Mr. Yakzan, in your opinion, when President Erdogan comes out and says that we've allocated 35 billion so far for refugees, and this includes, like he said, 4 million Syrian refugees within Turkey, how do you see this? Is there more weightage to this statement? Have we seen the kind of developments that would be associated with 35 billion? How do you see this in terms of the veracity of this statement?
Of course, there's no doubt Turkey worked as the biggest refugee community, and they helped the refugee community. And of course, we're talking about Syrian refugees, Afghanis, and many other countries. I mean, the statement, of course, the numbers, I don't have the right numbers. Of course, Mr. President Erdogan, he has all the machine to give him the right number. Yes, you have seen great help, and you mentioned the refugees living in the camp. Those camps are not, the Turkish government are closing the camp. They're taking the refugees to live more in the host community, to integrate. And when we talk about refugees, we're not talking about poor people who fled the country. We're talking about engineers, farmers, doctors, who will contribute to the society with the help, with the support, with the business as well. So we're talking about a huge number who's doing business, bringing business, and also dealing with the host community. So the number maybe sounds reasonable, and that will make more money and probably push the economy forward.
So Mr. Yakzan, is your communication with any of these refugee groups there in Turkey residing? As you said, a lot of them are also seen in cities, and not majority of them are actually in the refugee camps. I believe some numbers quote only 30% are in refugee camps in the border with Syria and Turkey. So what is your sense of what you learn from them when you speak to them in terms of what the Turkish government has been doing for them in these past few years?
Well, I will speak in general. The Turkish government being very helpful, and whenever I hold a meeting, and they were very helpful for any request from all the NGOs, the INGOs. The only thing, the refugees themselves, they were not sure if they're gonna go back to Syria. They'll be pushed out, stay in. The level of integration, are they gonna remain another 4 or 5 years, or they will go back as you mentioned, the safe zone or the new zone in Syria? That's where really harming the refugees, at least in mental status, as they're unstable because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's the main problem. I mean, of course, the services were great. They have access to the health system. They have access to the work system inside Turkey. And of course, many other systems. And that's great. I mean, for refugees, many other countries, they could not do as the Turkish government did to the Syrian, and of course we appreciate this as a Syrian. But we're really looking to see what's going to happen next.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Yakzan, for valuable input, joining us from Jordan there, giving what his experience has been working in one of the biggest IDP camps in Syria. Coming back to you, Mr. Yunus, trying to just take forward what Mr. Yakzan had mentioned there. This is a very legitimate concern, especially when it comes to Syrian refugees, in terms of what they're seeing in the near future of repatriation back to their country. I mean, there are, of course, many learned ones, people who had established businesses back in Syria, educated people. Will they be given the choice of leaving for their home, or if they want to stay in Turkey, will they have that kind of choice, or is this a clear out that all refugees must return?
I will show you the perspective, the long-term perspective. Before this crisis has started, the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad proposed the following. He proposed the unity of 5 seas and 5 countries. Now, this is an old concept that was already proposed by the founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He then, in 1920 already, proposed a confederation between Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Now, this is where all this is going to head to. That is a kind of confederation between Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Azerbaijan, and maybe Lebanon as well. So within that context, now this is the long-term perspective, within that context, these refugees might even stay in Turkey as well for a long term, because the region will, facing, as you mentioned, all these internal civil wars and displacement and refugees, the only solution that our region, our geography has is to unite. And within this unification, these refugees might even stay for a longer term in Turkey. In that case, their status in Turkey will have to be legalized, of course, but this is an option. This is definitely the option, and this is the reality of our country. Now, we have people living for years now in Turkey, and who have not been able to return to their country, and not just because they're educated, but they're part of our lives. So it is not an option just to expel them immediately. But we have to face the reality that some of them have integrated into Turkish society and have become part of our lives. And again, basic solution for this is not only to integrate the Syrian refugees, but to integrate our countries as a whole.
All right, thank you so much. But Mr. Yunus, stay with us. Let me welcome another guest joining us right now from Ankara. He's a political analyst, and forgive me if I get your name wrong, but Mr. Omer Ozkilic, thank you for joining Newswire here. Mr. Omer, we're talking about, as you must have heard Mr. Yunus commenting on the long-term vision here of the Confederation, of what they were seeing as coming together in unifying. And this is an attempt by President Erdogan also to forward that vision. What is your take on it, especially in terms of that 30-kilometer deep safe zone that he is proposing in Syria?
So all in all, we have to say that Turkey's position is quite clear in Syria, and Turkey has a clear vision for the future, and this composes a political transition process. So Turkey is still demanding a good political transition process in which the Assad regime and Assad himself has to step down, and there needs to be free elections supervised by the United Nations. And to these elections, not only Syrians who are inside Syria, but also Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey should be able to vote. So Turkey's position here is to have a political transition process. And Turkey is quite clear, if there's a free election inside Syria, the new government of Syria will be most likely at least not hostile towards Turkey. And the Syrian population over the years especially have seen the Turkish hospitality, they have recognized the Turkish aid, and most likely the government which will be formed by free elections will be also pro-Turkish. And additionally, in regards to the safe zone discussions east of the Euphrates, so we have to see there are many processes now going on simultaneously. The first process is between Turkey and the United States of America after the US decision to withdraw. There are negotiations going on, and the US still wants to protect the YPG, the Syrian branch of the PKK, which is a terrorist organization designated by Turkey, the US, the European Union, and NATO. And additionally, there's the second process going on with Russia. So there was a meeting between Turkish President Erdogan and Russian President Putin, in which the Adana agreement came onto the topic. So according to the Adana agreement in 1908, the Syrian government obligated itself to eliminate any PKK presence inside Syria, and if they don't do, Turkey has the allowance to enter Syrian territory and eliminate the terrorist threat by itself. So we know that Russia has put this on the agenda to suggest that the Assad regime should take care of the PKK in Syria. But actually there is a case which shows us that this isn't a possible solution for Turkey.
Because like you said, it's not an impossible solution, but at the same time, as President Erdogan, and you mentioned this earlier, trying to come to having negotiations with President Trump. But does the USA pose a stable, reliable ally at this time, especially considering just last month, in a surprise announcement, President Trump came out with this decision that we're withdrawing those 2,000 US troops from Syria?
So I don't think that it's about stable alliance or it's about trusting any partner. I don't think that Turkey will trust its own security to Russia or the United States of America. Turkey will take its own measures. For example, as I was explaining, the Tel Rifat case is very important here because in Tel Rifat there is a YPG presence. It was controlled by the YPG, and the Assad regime and the Russian military police entered these areas. But nevertheless, neither the attacks from Tel Rifat to the Turkish safe zones inside Syria and northern Aleppo and Afrin stopped, nor the PKK presence that was eliminated by the Assad regime and Russia. And on the other side, there is the United States of America, which still wants to protect the YPG as their partners on the ground. So I think Turkey has needs here to play its military power and has to take unilateral actions in order to secure its border and eliminate the terrorist threat. There isn't any scenario in which Turkey will trust its own security to Russia or the United States of America.
Okay, so it's interesting you're saying that, because here, Mr. Yunus, let me get your comments on something that President Erdogan tweeted yesterday during that OIC subcommittee meeting with the Red Crescent, also the Turkish Red Crescent. He said something specifically, and it came out straight out off the bat without any sort of holding back, where he said there are powers who have gone into Syria, who have empowered, trained and terrorists and have now withdrawn. How does this reflect on especially the negotiations going on between Turkey and USA?
The negotiations between Turkey and USA and the US are actually, for our consideration, a loss of time. A loss of time because we, as you mentioned, and as Mr. Erdogan also mentioned, the US has been arming the PKK, has been teaching the PKK, has been financing the PKK, has been paying even monthly salaries to PKK fighters or the PYD fighters. So the negotiations with them are basically a loss of time. There is no perspective in that. And it is the success of the Astana negotiations, actually, and of course, first of all, the resistance of the Assad government that forced the US to withdraw from Syria. So it is the alliance between Turkey, Russia, and Iran, and the resistance of the Assad government and their military and their people that forced the US to withdraw. And this is the road that Turkey has to follow, and this is the road that Turkey will follow. Now, concerning the commentaries of my colleague Ozkilic from Ankara, insistence of the Syrian government's future composition, this is American politics. Insistence on a transition process, this is American politics. Insistence on a new constitution, this is American politics, considering also an autonomous so-called Kurdish zone in the east of Euphrates. This is a dead end. There is no way that this is going to be realized, and there is no way that this suits in any way into Turkish security interests. Now, Turkish security interests, first and above all, need a unified, non-federal Syria. And this means a no to new constitution, and this means a no to any kind of transition process. And this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. We will lose some time waiting for a positive American answer, as happened already in the Munich agreement before. But we will wake up and we will find that Russia and Iran are our allies, are our trusted allies, who share the same interests as Turkey concerning regional stability and the unity of our countries, and we will act accordingly.
But there's also a criticism, and I want to come back to you, Mr. Omer, to hear your take on what Mr. Yunus has said. But before we do, very quickly, Mr. Yunus, if you could expand on the criticism towards Putin also, that his role in Syria has not been very constructive from the get-go. He was responsible for bringing in terrorists from all corners of Syria to support this fight as a proxy war. I mean, does that not go against what you're also saying in terms of the long-term future of Syria?
I have no information at all about Russian financing of local terror groups in Syria. What we clearly observed was the Russian assistance to the Syrian government which was an important assistance in maintaining the Syrian unity, in maintaining the Syrian territorial integrity, and which was a positive contribution to fight against terror groups within Syria, actually. By the way, also against the PKK and the PYD forces, partly around the region of Deir ez-Zor. So I don't have any information that confirms the cited criticism that Russia has been supporting.
Let me ask you the same thing, Mr. Omer, and also the entire comment that we were hearing that this is American politics and it really has no long-term effect whatsoever. What's your take on this?
So, first of all, if something is demanded by the US and the same is demanded by Turkey, it doesn't mean that Turkey is acting for US interests or this is US policy. Because Turkey has its own national agenda, and it's quite clear that Turkey has disputes with the US, especially in regards to the PKK. But we shouldn't forget that Turkey is still demanding a political transition process. This is not a US demand, because US lives thousands of kilometers away from Syria, but Turkey is the neighboring country of Syria. So for Turkey, it's really important to have the free elections, to have the genuine government there, and not a regime which kills thousands of its people and displaces millions of its people to other countries. We know that the Assad, important representatives of the Assad regime actually said that they have a list of 3 million terrorists. So this is something impossible. And there are still tortures in prison. There are still civilians killed by the Assad regime. And it was only thanks to the Turkish military presence inside Idlib and Afrin and northern Aleppo that stopped the aerial bombardment of the Assad regime, which killed civilians, which bombarded hospitals, which bombarded civil markets. So we have to see that Turkey is still opposing the Assad regime, and this is a Turkish policy, because we have here a comparison, because in Lebanon, they are living above 1 million Syrian refugees. In Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. And despite the entire area bordering Lebanon captured by the Assad regime, only 50,000 Syrian refugees returned from Lebanon back to Syria. And the living conditions in Lebanon for refugees are much worse than they are in Turkey. But we know that in the tiny area of northern Aleppo, which was liberated by Turkey and is controlled by the Syrian opposition, 300,000 Syrian refugees returned back to these areas. So also in regard of the Turkish alliance with Iran and Russia, there isn't any alliance, because Turkey is an ally of the US, it's a NATO ally, but there are disputes, and Turkey is cooperating with regional actors. With Russia, there is a partnership, with Iran, there is a partnership, because this is international politics. We don't live anymore in the Cold War period. So Turkey is doing in the Astana process, negotiations with Iran and Russia. There are also disagreements. And we also know that Russia and Iran and the Assad regime have also supported the PKK. So before the US went into Syria, it was the Assad regime who was the main supporter and backer of the PKK. And it was the Assad regime who handed over Afrin, Ain al-Arab, and areas in Kamishli to the YPG. So
I'm sorry, Mr. Omar, we'll have to interrupt you here as we have a short break. But as we come back, let's talk a little more about these alliances and who they've been backing and how their stances have changed. With that, let's take a quick short break. Keep watching Newswire. Welcome back to Newswire. We were talking with our guests about the allies and their stance in Syria as one of the biggest civil wars continue in this region. With that, let me also welcome a new guest who is joining us. We have Dr. Yahya Al-Aridi, who is a Syrian politician and has been part of the Syrian Negotiations Commission. He's joining us from Strasbourg. Thank you so much for joining us here in Newswire. Let me first of all, right off the bat, on the developments that have taken place, what President Erdogan has been saying yesterday in Istanbul in terms of allocating funds for the refugees, and also in establishing a safe zone in Syria. I would like to hear your take on this. How do you see the negotiations turning out?
Well, as you know, greetings to you and to your guests. As you know, that the Syrian situation has been dragging on and on for years, and it has been in the hands of many strong powers, including super ones, the United States, Russia, and others. Everybody has their say in the situation. It's no longer a struggle between a people who rose for their freedom and liberty, for democracy, and dictatorship. It is no longer that situation. Everybody has their own interests, and Syria, if not geographically, politically, and psychologically, has been torn up between these powers, and everybody is trying to solidify their situation on the ground, in the hearts of people, in terms of interests, etc. Now, what is happening with regard to this safe zone? This is an old idea. It has been suggested early on that there could be a safe zone that could somehow prevent those hundreds of thousands of people who fled from their homes or who were displaced purposefully by the bombardment by the Assad regime and its supporters, be they Iran or the Russians, and to just hold them in that region. The safe zone or a secure area, as you know, has all sorts of requirements at the military level, at logistics, etc., and has to have political support. It didn't go through. Also, there was a reason behind that. At a particular point, nobody wanted Turkey to be somehow. They wanted to get Turkey involved and get Turkey in trouble into that, to get it trapped into that safe zone. It didn't work, and now a renewal of this idea for the purpose of just the return of refugees, which whose number exceeds 3 million in Turkey. They could return to that. To what extent this is logical, this is possible, this is feasible, nobody knows.
But
However,
Dr. Yahya, could you expand a little when you say wanting Turkey to get trapped in the pretext of the safe zone? This is something that they have proposed themselves, whether or not the US will cooperate. As President Erdogan said, could you flesh it out for us for a little bit?
Well, as you know, the longest borders between two countries are the ones between Syria and Turkey. They are around 1,000 kilometers to the north of Syria and to the south of Turkey. And Turkey historically has this problem with certain organizations that Turkey says they are terrorists, including the PKK and PYD, etc. And they had this national fear that they are they threaten the security of Turkey. Now, the geography in which they spread or they exist, those organizations are not limited to Turkey itself. They are in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, etc. And they take also the plight of Kurdish people into their hands, and they use them as an umbrella that they have a case. And actually, they have an outside connection. They have outside connections. They are actually proven to have carried out terrorist acts. And as you know, there was an accord between Syrian government in 1998 and Turkey, the so-called Adana Accord, yes, where Turkey can go into the Syrian territory up to 5 to 7 kilometers inside the country, and in order to chase those labeled terrorists. Now, with the development of the Syrian situation and with the presence of millions of Syrians in Turkey, Turkey has started to suffer from all that, and it's got a hand in all the Syrian situation at all levels, militarily, human-wise, and etc. Now, with the developments of the northeastern part of Syria and the decision by Trump to withdraw, there has to be somebody to fill out this vacuum that could be left by the departure of American forces. Turkey was the best candidate to do that with the help of the Free Syrian Army. Now, this got into all sorts of complications. The story is complicated. Iran has a hand there. Russia has a hand through Astana, etc. All these things also contributed to the complication of the situation. Now, as we understand that there was some sort of understanding between Russia, between United States and Turkey, the three of them, probably Iran, that there could be a safe zone in that area to the north.
So, Dr. Yahya, sorry to interrupt you again, but just trying to get to the bottom of this issue. The YPG, which is seen as the effective ground force by the U.S. in the fight against Daesh, the fight against ISIS, is also seen as a terrorist organization by Turkey. Now, how do they both come, and how do you see them both come together, especially when a talk of a safe zone is coming to a more concrete level?
Well, they could guarantee a safe zone, but on top of that, just they serve their own interests by just driving the PKK, the other groups that are labeled terrorists out of that area, with the civilian population just going back to their homeland and ruling themselves. This is the understanding that was spread, that was being circulated, and this is an understanding that is developing. To what extent it could succeed, we don't yet know. However, there is still talk about these things, and there are some summits on the way of next month. There is Astana, probably to establish the basic rules that would govern this secure or zone, the safe zone.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Yahya, for your valuable opinion there. Let me come back to you, Mr. Yunus. Again, let me put forward this question because it really leaves a lot of ambiguity. The YPG is seen as linked to the PKK, what Turkey categorizes as terrorists, and yet this is the party that the US has been saying has played a crucial role in fighting ISIS in Syria. How long is this sticking point going to come in the way in establishing a more concrete sort of development in Syria for establishing whether it's a buffer zone or it's a safe zone, especially since there are also over 3.7 million refugees looking to go back home?
The contradiction that you point out is a correct one, and it is a contradiction which lies ahead of the Turkish government as well. And we think that in the long term, the safe zone is not the final solution for this problem. The safe zone is a positive step if it removes the PKK a little bit more from the Turkish border, but it is not the final solution. Now, as a member of the Vatan Partisi delegations, I have been visiting Syria several times since the crisis has begun, and we have concluded talks with the Syrian government on all levels, including a meeting with Mr. Bashar al-Assad as well. And in all these meetings, we talked about exactly this problem, the intent of the United States to divide the country of Syria, as well as in the long term to divide the country of Turkey. And we have faced a very prepared and ready Syrian government at all levels to cooperate with Turkey at all levels and at all measures to fight a joint fight against so-called separatist terrorism led especially by the PKK and the YPG and sponsored by the US. So this is the final solution to this problem, not some 30 kilometers or 15 kilometers, a buffer zone or a safe zone. The long-term road to lead is once again, a cooperation between Ankara and Damascus against the PKK, and this will finish immediately the PKK, and this will finish the US plans immediately, and Damascus is ready to that, and Ankara is moving closer to that position.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Yunus, for your contribution there today. Coming to you, Mr. Omer, let's talk a little very quickly about, as he mentioned, this contradiction. It sticks out very openly, does not make sense of what is trying to be established there in Syria, at least in terms of concrete steps. Now what we're seeing is we are also seen a development with Iran, these 11 agreements and memorandum of understandings being established for economic opportunities within Syria. I mean, there is a tune of billions of dollars of destruction. One UN report said up to 400 billion infrastructure has been destroyed. So there is obviously a lot of space to work on. And Iran is now coming into this game. How do you see this, especially where the West has really taken Iran as a major threat to security, whether it's to Israel, to the US? So could you give me your take on this development?
So first of all, we have to point out that in regards to what said my colleague in Istanbul, the Assad regime is now at the moment protecting the PKK in Tel Rifat. They are protecting the PKK in Arima. And it was the Assad regime which enabled the PKK in Syria. And also historically, it was the Assad regime who played a crucial role in forming the PKK. And additionally, official declaration and demands and statements by the Assad regime also indicate something very different from what my colleague in Istanbul said. They actually want to protect the PKK from Turkey. Secondly, about the role of Iran and the reconstruction of Syria, I think here the crucial actor is the Assad regime again, because it's the Assad regime who enables the Iranian presence in Syria. It's the Assad regime who enabled the Hezbollah in Syria, and it's also the Assad regime who enabled and all these various different Shia militias inside Syria, who are some of them are designated as terrorist organization by the United States of America. So, and there were recently a clash between the Iranian-backed 4th Division and 4th Corps and the Russian-backed 5th Corps in Syria. So there are also internal clash between the Russian-backed militias and the Iranian-backed militias inside Syria. So all in all, if we see and compare this with the return of refugees to Assad-held areas, we see that a solution for Syria with the Assad regime in power is not possible. So neither will the reconstruction start if the Assad regime is in power, nor will Iran be pushed out of Syria, and nor will the refugees return to the home countries. So
but hypothetically speaking, sorry to interrupt you, but the PKK, the Kurds, where are they going to go? I mean, hypothetically speaking, if the Assad stays in power, is this a realistic expectation that they can be eliminated for the benefit of those who feel them as a threat?
So in regards of the Syrian Kurds, there are many different actors of the Syrian Kurds. So the PKK is just one of them, which got empowered by the Assad regime first and then by the United States of America. I think if the YPG is being eliminated and contained by military means, other Syrian Kurdish groups will take a huge role. For example, inside the Syrian opposition, there are the Kurdish National Council. So 16 different Kurdish political parties are represented. Then there are also the Syrian Peshmerga, and there are also Kurdish military groups inside the Turkish-backed Syrian opposition. So all in all, I think the Syrian Kurds will play a huge role in the future of Syria. But currently, the YPG controls areas which are Arab populated. So even the safe zone, the majority of the population inside the safe zone is Arab, not Kurdish, because the Kurdish population in Syria is in Afrin, which is now controlled by the Syrian opposition, in Ain al-Arab, and in villages around Kamishli. All of the rest east of the Euphrates are Arabs, actually. And the tribes in this region are also supportive of Turkey and against the PKK. Mm-hmm. And I think in the long term, the Kurds will play a role like the Turkmens in Syria, like the Assyrians, like the Druze. Mm-hmm. But for this, there needs to be a legitimate democratic government in Syria, which we don't have now.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Omar, for your value put there. We've been speaking to you about how the allies are getting together and how realistic are the goals that they're negotiating over. But coming back to one of the biggest problems that we are seeing in this region is the humanitarian crisis. Syria is no alien to that. They've seen over 6 million displaced within the country and more even around the world. Now, here I would like to welcome a guest who has an expertise on refugees, on migration, on displacement. Mr. Asif Munier is joining us from Dhaka. Thank you so much for joining us here on Newswire. Just coming to the issue of what we have seen, Turkey being the one country that has hosted the most Syrian refugees. I want to take the conversation on a global scale and reflect a little on what other countries are facing right now, a struggle in hosting large number of refugees. If you could just shed some light on that for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. What we already see is, of course, the Palestinian refugees, and which is a long-term issue. But in Bangladesh, we have the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. So that's kind of something that we in Bangladesh have faced a lot. And in terms of the safe zone, that has been discussed a little bit. For instance, from the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, that was one of the proposals. But even for this case, where the identity of the Rohingya community is not recognized by their own people, like the authorities in Myanmar, the idea of safe zone was rejected by the authorities there. And then again, analysts were talking about that who creates that safe zone and how will that be managed and monitored when UN agencies don't have access to Myanmar and it's very much controlled by the military regime there. So in terms of looking at options in terms of, safe zone or a neutral zone where refugee communities can live for a longer time, so far there are not good examples that can be followed. So it might be interesting if this is a realistic step for the Syrian refugees, whether it works or not.
It's interesting.
At what extent, that's again an issue.
Right. I'm glad you brought this up because what we've seen overall in countries that are hosting a large number of refugees is a repatriation policy. I mean, Pakistan has been the only country in the world, in this region, who has hosted the largest number of Afghan refugees. They've been there for the past 40 years. We've seen a constant inflow of Afghans settling down on the borders, settling down in other cities of the country. Now, just reflecting on what the struggles have been, UNHCR has worked very closely with Pakistan on this. Could you highlight some of the issues that start affecting the country on a long-term basis when such a big exodus of refugees settles down in a country?
Yeah, it is a difficult issue, especially for where the origin country is not sort of in a situation where the original, the citizens can get back to that country. If that happens, it is, a difficult, it's like in a limbo. People who live in a sort of refugee-like situation for a long period of time, they do not have any kind of permanency where they live. So in terms of either they go back to where they came from and have a peaceful life like before they were in a refugee-like situation, or they remain where they are, because it's also kind of a huge issue of settling down somewhere, and whether they seek asylum or they live in refugee-like camps, which is not sort of desirable. The first desire would be to actually have a condition where they can go back to their original countries, whether it's Afghan refugees, Palestinians, Syrians, or Rohingyas.
It is a struggle to establish, like you said, a safe policy on where they would, how would they, especially their cultural differences, how would they amalgamate in that country in itself, whether they would even choose to go back if there is a policy finally evolving in the years to come. Pakistan itself has hosted over 3 million Afghan refugees right now. 1.38 have been registered. Another million are supposed to be somewhere in the borders. Now, coming back to the original question of the well-being of these refugees, what work is the UNHCR able to put forth with countries to come together to help their repatriation? If you were to take a case in point, what is happening in your country, what efforts are being made, and is it even getting the due attention from the international community? Yeah.
Firstly, I would say that, I work with different UN agencies, and I'm not representing the view of the UNHCR as such. I can say from experience what happens is that wherever these refugees are sort of in a refugee-like situation, first, the host country, we may say, has to accept the role of the UNHCR. And given the mandate, certain kind of mandate is international, the principle of non-refoulement. But even then, for instance, the countries which would have not signed the Refugee Convention, those countries are not bound to follow the principle of non-refoulement. So then UNHCR has to negotiate special conditions. Of course, they provide certain kind of provision, but in terms of repatriation, it has to be negotiated with the, either the origin country and then...
Okay, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you here.
And they have to be party to the UN Convention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asif Munier, for joining us here on the Newswire. And with that, we've come to the end of the show. We'll see you tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.